Welcome to Viking Hearths and Hazards. Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a world where danger didn't always wear a helmet and swing an axe. Sometimes it hid in the kitchen wearing soot and flour. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it in your corner of the world? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through the entrance of a Viking longhouse, ducking your head as the woven straw door flap brushes past your shoulders. Inside, it's warm but not cozy. It's smoky, dry, and just a little chaotic, like a family reunion in a barn if everyone brought their livestock and forgot deodorant. Your eyes adjust to the dim light as you step past low wooden benches covered in hides, ducking to avoid the sharp glint of hanging iron tools, dried fish, and the odd herb bundle swaying from the beams like sleepy bats. Your nose twitches. There's something scorched in the air. And no, it's not a burning ship or a battle camp. It's bread. More specifically, a thick, blackened crust clinging to the edge of a primitive clay oven that sits sunken and hissing in the corner. You wouldn't survive this, let's be honest. That oven alone has claimed more hair, hope, and hearth robes than any Viking skirmish. While Viking women were famously fearless, managing homes, commanding farms, fending off attackers when needed, there was one thing they approached with genuine terror: baking day. And tonight, you're about to find out why. The oven in question is built of clay and stone, shaped like a dome with a wide maw in the front, reminiscent of a beast mid-roar. It was a miracle of domestic engineering for the time, and an absolute menace. It would be stoked with logs or peat until it glowed red-hot inside. Then the embers scraped out, and dough slapped onto a flat stone or into the heated cavity. Sounds simple, but nothing ever went according to plan. You see, it didn't come with temperature dials or timers. It didn't even come with a front door most of the time. Timing depended on instinct, weather, luck, and whatever wisdom you could extract from an ant who may or may not have gone mildly smoke-mad after a decade of baking in winter. The fire didn't behave. It flared, it sulked, it spat smoke into your eyes. The dough didn't behave either. It rose too much or too little, sometimes exploding into a gooey lava that dripped into the flames or fused to the cooking stone like a flour-based curse. So yes, Viking women feared that oven, not because they lacked skill or courage, but because this thing seemed sentient. It knew your weaknesses. One scholarly debate that still simmers today is whether the design of these hearth ovens was influenced more by Celtic traditions or imported through Norse contact with Saxon and Slavic cultures. Archaeologists have unearthed several regional differences in oven structure, some with built-in venting chimneys, others completely open, and the variety suggests a surprising level of experimentation. But regardless of the blueprint, the outcome was the same: half-cooked loaves and singed eyebrows. One mainstream fact is that bread was a staple of the Viking diet, often made from barley, rye, or oats. Wheat was a luxury rarely seen outside trade hubs. Bread wasn't fluffy and soft. It was dense, often gritty with sand or husks. Why gritty? Because the hand-milled flour was processed using grindstones that chipped over time, leaving tiny rock particles in your meal. That means every bite of your Viking toast could potentially be a dental hazard. On the fringe side of things, some evidence suggests that early Viking bakers may have believed certain breads had spiritual properties, especially the first loaf baked in a new season. There are traces of offerings found at some burial sites, charred lumps of bread placed beside the dead, possibly as nourishment for the afterlife. Or maybe the family just wanted to be rid of that particular loaf. Either way, bread was more than food. It was ritual, it was economy, and sometimes it was punishment. But we're not done setting the scene. As you move closer to the oven, you hear it creak, a strange sound for something made of stone. It's not just heat, it's pressure. It's ancient clay expanding, threatening to crack. And as the woman tending it reaches forward to toss in a new lump of dough, you watch her sleeves carefully tied back, her hair wrapped tightly, and yet, still, you see the little singed curls at her temples. No one escaped unscathed. Her arms bear faint scorch marks. Her nails are ringed with flour. There's a story in every scar. She moves with the precision of someone who has done this 1,000 times and still doesn't trust the process. She glances at you. "If it hisses, run," she says with a smirk. This isn't a hobby. It's warfare. The battles outside the village might bring stories, but the fight to feed everyone every day using unreliable dough, smoky air, and a fire that wants to eat your face, that's the real legend. You notice kids creeping along the back wall, avoiding eye contact with the hearth. Even the family dog gives it wide berth. You smell burnt grain and the faintest trace of wild honey. Maybe today's batch is sweetbread. Maybe it's another carbon brick. Either way, it must be done. Every home had its fire, and every fire had its mistress. This wasn't just domestic labor. It was survival, honor, and sometimes a test of endurance worthy of saga. The irony isn't lost on you. The same women who ran farms, negotiated dowries, and buried their husbands with dignity were the ones who could be unmade by a moody oven. A failed loaf wasn't just food wasted. It was time, energy, and reputation down the drain. You sip from a wooden mug of warm goat's milk and try not to inhale the black smoke curling up past the rafters. Just another peaceful Viking evening, right? Except the oven just popped again. That can't be good. And yet, this was the heartbeat of Viking domestic life. This fire-fed, flour-dusted chaos. The war stories made it into the sagas, but no one told you about the dough demons hiding in every hearth. Until now. That time bread tried to kill you. You wake up early, earlier than even the goats, and you already regret it. The longhouse is cold, the hearth has died overnight, and your breath fogs in the dawn air like tiny ghosts escaping your lungs. Your bare feet pad across the wooden floor as you head toward the central fire pit, where embers still smolder under ash like an old grudge. You poke it back to life and add peat chunks, which hiss and spit as if offended to be woken. Today is baking day, and though your back already aches in anticipation, the real dread is not the kneading or the flour dust that will work its way into places it has no business being. No, the dread comes from what waits in the corner, the oven. It looms like a sleeping creature, cracked with age, its interior blackened by 1,000 meals and a dozen near-death experiences. You'd rather face a berserker than this smoldering clay monster. You approach it cautiously, like it might lunge, and it has, before, belching out flames at your sister-in-law, knocking a bowl of starter into the dirt, even setting your aunt's dress alight once during a solstice bake. But today, it's your turn. You kneel beside it, checking the firebox, and the heat radiates outward with the heavy presence of something alive. You stoke the fire, building it up until the stones are hot enough to roast an enemy. By now, the rest of the household is stirring. Children shuffle past, holding their noses dramatically as smoke coils upward. Your cousin mutters something about bread demons again and retreats to the barn. You can't blame her. She remembers last month when the dough exploded mid-bake and hit the ceiling with a wet slap that echoed like a war drum. You had to scrape it down with a knife and pretend it never happened. Mainstream Viking fact? Bread was baked in communal batches when possible, especially in winter, when everyone huddled indoors like nervous squirrels. Multiple households might share the hearth, taking turns and bickering over whose loaf was undercooked or who used too much ash. But the fringe detail no one talks about? Sometimes the dough really did behave like it had a vendetta. There are saga fragments, often dismissed as metaphor, that speak of vengeful dough and loaves that bit back. One tale from an obscure regional poem describes a baker who swore her rye loaf howled before she placed it in the oven. And after baking, it cracked itself in half down the center and smoked like incense. Of course, modern scholars laugh this off. Yeast gases, baking expansion, nothing more. But you've seen things. Once, your bread rose so violently that it knocked over the paddle and singed a sleeve. Another time, the starter overflowed the trough and spread across the table like a slow-moving creature. You joke about it, but part of you watches that dough rise with the same suspicion you'd give a wounded animal. Scholarly debates swirl around how Viking women managed fermentation without modern tools. Theories range from relying on wild airborne yeast to cultivating sourdough mothers passed down through generations. Some argue this wasn't even true fermentation by modern standards, but a kind of proto-bread halfway between porridge and flatbread, with inconsistent texture and wild flavor profiles. Archaeological samples of carbonized bread loaves show irregular density, indicating unpredictable rising patterns. And unpredictable patterns mean unpredictable baking, and unpredictable baking means danger. You remember last autumn's feast when your neighbor Helga tried a new barley blend. The result? An oven incident so explosive it required rebuilding half the hearth. She insists it was a test of courage. You call it a warning. Today, you're sticking to oat and rye, safe and starchy. The grind was rough, literally. You spent hours yesterday with the quernstone, turning grain into flour, knowing full well it would leave your arms sore and your fingernails crusted with dust. And that's before you even reach the baking. As the fire heats the oven walls, you mix your dough. It's sticky, stubborn, and determined to glue itself to your elbows. You knead it with both hands, using the full weight of your shoulders until the surface is elastic and warm. The smell of yeast and effort rises around you. You let it rest, covering it with a cloth embroidered by your grandmother, stained now with memories of meals and misfires. While the dough rises, you take a moment to breathe. You sit on a low stool and watch the oven, always watching. Outside, snow drifts gently against the sod roof, muffling the world in quiet white. Inside, everything is tense. You test the oven by flicking water inside. It hisses instantly. Good. Hot enough. You brush out the embers with a long paddle and prepare the baking stone. The dough is ready. You shape it into 2 thick loaves and slide them in, heart pounding. You close the opening with a wooden plank and seal the cracks with mud paste. Now you wait. The room is thick with smoke and silence. Even the goats have stopped chewing. Then, thump. A dull sound from within. You leap to your feet. The plank shudders. You grab a cloth and yank it open. Steam and smoke billow out, and you cough as you peer inside. One loaf has cracked violently, oozing dough onto the stone like a fallen soldier. The other has ballooned into a strange, lopsided shape, its crust already blackening. You sigh. Not a disaster, but not a triumph either. Just another round in your long war with the oven. As the loaves finish baking, you scrape the stone with a stick and whisper promises to the gods of dough. You'll get it right next time. You always say that. But deep down, you know, the oven will always win at least once. You remove the bread, set it to cool, and examine the damage. Your hair smells like smoke again. Your eyebrows feel singed. There's flour in your ear, and yet the bread is warm, slightly sweet, and, miraculously, edible. A small victory in a world of flaming betrayals. You sit, tearing off a piece, and chew thoughtfully. Crunchy, gritty, charred in spots, and still, somehow, comforting. Maybe tomorrow you'll bake again, or maybe not. The oven will decide. The longhouse smells like desperation. You'd think, after surviving yesterday's flour-fueled duel with the bread oven, today might feel a little calmer. But as you pull back the flap of hide covering the longhouse doorway, the first thing you're hit with isn't cold air or the scent of dawn dew. It's the thick, stale tang of ash, wet wool, and something unmistakably burnt. Again. The longhouse smells like desperation and old bread. You step in, blinking through the gloom as daylight filters in through the smoke hole overhead. Your eyes sting slightly, and it's not just from the soot. It's from the collective memory of a dozen bread fails lingering in the air. The fire pit is crackling weakly, trying its best to rally after a damp night. A few embers blink lazily like tired eyes. You notice someone's hung fish to dry near the rafters again, and further back, something unspeakable bubbles in a pot. But all your attention returns, like a moth to a flame, to the squat, soot-covered oven crouched in the corner. It's as if it's watching you back. The mainstream historical fact of the day: Viking longhouses, especially in Scandinavia around the 9th and 10th centuries, often had centralized hearths or clay ovens toward one end of the house. These ovens weren't just for baking. They heated the space, smoked meats, and even doubled as warm sleeping spots for animals, or occasionally humans who'd had too much mead. But baking? That was the real battleground. And here's where things get weird. The fringe fact comes in the form of superstitions. Across coastal Norway, scattered references describe oven spirits, or flour demons, entities said to take offense if you swore too close to the dough or forgot to bless the flour. Some women tied tiny rune-carved bones near the oven entrance, not for decoration, but to ward off kitchen curses. Your great-aunt once whispered that a girl from the next village sang to her sourdough every morning, convinced that a cheerful tune made it rise more obediently. Honestly, given your results last week, you're starting to consider it. But the debate scholars can't seem to settle is how these ovens actually functioned in such tight quarters. With little ventilation, no proper chimney, and barely any airflow, how did anyone breathe, let alone bake? Some archaeologists argue that smoke was simply a daily fact of life. Women adapted, squinting through tears, accepting singed lungs as the price of civilization. Others believe there must have been more effective smoke dispersal systems, lost to time, or perhaps removed when houses collapsed and left only scorched stones behind. But standing here now, eyes watering, it's hard to believe any of them ever worked that well. You sit on a fur-covered stool near the oven, rubbing your hands for warmth and preparing to knead another batch of dough. The flour sack sits limply beside you, tied shut with a leather thong. You untie it, puffing flour dust into the air like a magician gone rogue. A few grains find their way into your nose, triggering a sneeze loud enough to make the dog bark in its sleep. Today's dough is a mix of rye and barley, less prone to drama, you hope. As you add water from a horn cup and begin to stir, your arms already protest. Kneading isn't delicate work. It's a full-body endeavor, like wrestling an uncooperative bear cub. You press, fold, slam, and stretch until your wrists ache and your knuckles go white. It's during this mechanical rhythm that your mind wanders, like all Viking women's minds must have, back when baking was one of the only quiet times you had to yourself. You remember your grandmother's stories about the loaf that screamed. Supposedly, it hissed loudly just as she was pulling it out, and the sound echoed like a banshee's wail. She threw it into the river. "No bread is worth that," she'd muttered, and you'd laughed as a child. Now, you'd probably have done the same. The oven is heating slowly, fueled by dry peat cakes collected over the summer. You watch the smoke spiral upward, vanishing through the roof hole like prayers whispered into the cold. You hum under your breath, not out of joy, but out of habit. They say the dough can tell when you're anxious. You don't know if it's true, but at this point, you're not taking chances. A young cousin pops in, sniffing the air. "It smells like it's already burnt," she says with the brutal honesty of children. You glare at her. "It's not even in yet." She shrugs and vanishes. You shape the dough into loaves, dust the tops with flour, and set them aside. Your palms are sticky, your back sore. You glance at the oven. It glows faintly now, the heat radiating in uneven pulses. You test it again with a splash of water, and it hisses back at you like an angry cat. That's the signal. Time to bake. You use a long-handled wooden peel, carved and passed down through generations, to slide the loaves inside. The opening is tight, the angle awkward, and the loaves wobble slightly as you maneuver them onto the stone. One leans too far and almost tips over. You mutter a prayer. You close the oven with its makeshift wooden door and seal the edges with mud. Then you wait. You wait in silence, surrounded by the damp scent of wool, the ever-present drift of ash, and the slow tick of time. Baking isn't exciting. It's a tension you carry in your spine while pretending to be calm. The house quiets around you. Even the chickens seem to be holding their breath. You think you hear a creak from inside the oven. You hope it's just the bread rising. You wait a little longer. The smell hits first. Earthy, sour, and slightly sweet. Not bad. You carefully unseal the door, using a cloth to avoid burning your fingers. Steam rushes out. You peer inside. One loaf is golden brown, puffed up like a pillow. The other is flat, very flat, and leaning against the side wall as if trying to escape. You pull them both out. The good one smells like victory. The flat one? Regret. You place them on a plank to cool. They crackle softly, like they're laughing at you. But even the flat one might still be edible. You take a bite. It's dense, but it's warm, slightly sour, and miraculously, not gritty. For a moment, the longhouse doesn't smell like desperation. It smells like home. The oven was basically a volcano. You step outside the longhouse with your lungs craving clean, cold air, and your face still tingling from the proximity of the morning's heat. Behind you, The low roof of the longhouse exhales a curling ribbon of smoke, rising steadily into the gray sky like the breath of a sleepy dragon who hasn't decided whether to roast you or leave you be. You rub your wrists, dusted with flour and stiff from kneading, and try not to think about the sound the oven made just before you stepped outside. A deep, slow crack, like something under pressure, remembering how to fail. You've heard that sound before. The last time, it ended with scorched eyebrows and a loaf that shot out of the oven like it was trying to escape. And even now, standing on damp earth, surrounded by frost and the scent of pine and old fish, you feel the oven watching you from inside the wall. Not like a tool, more like a rival. Or worse, an ancient cranky house spirit who just happens to bake bread. You stretch your arms toward the sun that refuses to rise fully this time of year. It's midwinter, and the light that trickles across the snow is pale and indifferent. You've already baked 3 loaves today. One of them exploded, another fused to the hearthstone. The third survived, barely. So naturally, you're about to go back in and do it again. Because Viking women don't rest, especially not on baking day. And especially not when tomorrow's festival depends on enough loaves to feed everyone, including that one cousin who eats like a bear just waking from hibernation. As you step back into the longhouse, the temperature shift hits you like a smoldering blanket. It's warm, yes, but in the oppressive way of trapped heat and lingering smoke. The oven sits like a squatting beast against the far wall, its surface glowing in patches where the clay is hottest, and you can hear the faint groan as it settles, heat expanding through its cracks like anger in slow motion. Here's the historical truth. Viking ovens were built from clay and stone, roughly dome-shaped, and constructed directly inside the longhouse or in sheltered cookhouses nearby. They were fired with wood, turf, or peat, which was burned directly inside the oven until the walls were superheated. Then, once the fire was scraped out, dough was placed on the hot stone surface, sealed inside, and left to bake using residual heat. There were no chimneys, no vents, no knobs, no safeties, just intuition and luck. But the fringe part, the part that most people gloss over, is this. These ovens were terrifying. They were unpredictable, moody, and, under the wrong conditions, deadly. There are records, not many, but enough, of ovens cracking under pressure, sometimes from sudden changes in temperature, sometimes from wet clay expanding too fast, sometimes from just being old and angry. In one Icelandic saga, a woman's oven is described as splitting like a tree under Thor's hammer. And while that might sound poetic, archaeologists have actually found evidence of collapsed ovens with fragments blown outward, like a volcano mid-eruption. The debate among scholars is whether this was a design flaw or a known risk Viking women simply worked around. Some researchers believe Viking ovens were influenced by earlier Roman models brought north through trade and cultural contact, especially during the later Iron Age. Others argue these were entirely native designs, evolving differently across regions. In Denmark, for example, they found ovens half sunken into the earth, likely to help retain heat and reduce fire risk. In Norway, freestanding models appear more common, sometimes located dangerously close to livestock pens. And the real question remains, how did they avoid constant disaster? The truth is, they didn't. The average Viking woman accepted that baking was a gamble. You light the fire again, carefully feeding it dried twigs and bits of peat. The flame catches slowly, then hungrily, curling upward into the dome like it belongs there. You sit cross-legged with your dough bowl between your knees, kneading again. This batch is different, sweetened with honey and mixed with ground nuts, meant for ceremonial use. You're not allowed to mess this one up. It's for tomorrow's Yule celebration, and if it goes wrong, it won't just be the bread that's scorched. Your pride will be too. As you knead, your muscles working rhythmically, your mind drifts. You remember when your mother used to hum while she baked, old lullabies passed down from her grandmother, songs about sun gods and growing grain and hiding salt in the corner of the bowl to keep the trolls out. You used to think it was just superstition. Now, as your dough rises unevenly and the oven creaks ominously again, you're not so sure. You check the heat. The inside glows, orange-red, and when you toss in a splash of water, it sizzles instantly. Perfect. You scrape out the coals, spread ash along the bottom to prevent sticking, and gently shape the loaves. The dough smells amazing, yeasty, nutty, with the faint floral sting of fermented honey. You slide one loaf in, then the second. You seal the mouth with a plank, then pack damp moss and mud around the edges to trap the heat inside. Now comes the part you hate most. The waiting. The long, silent, itchy waiting. Your hands twitch. Your back aches. Every few minutes you listen, trying to hear the subtle signs of whether the bread is baking or betraying you. A pop, a hiss, a distant crack. You leap up, heart pounding. You crouch beside the oven. The seal is leaking steam, but that's normal, mostly. You pull away the plank and squint into the mouth of the beast. One loaf has split slightly along the top. That's fine. That's expected. The other has shifted. It leans toward the side wall like it's trying to escape. You don't like that. You jab the paddle in and try to nudge it, but the crust is already hardening, and it resists. You withdraw. You wait a bit more. 5 more minutes. Then, just as you're deciding whether to check again, it happens. A sound like thunder in miniature, a dull, abrupt crack, and a thin line splits up the oven's side. You freeze. That's new. That's bad. You scramble for the ash bucket, pat the crack with damp soot to cool the expansion. You mutter a string of old prayers, none of which rhyme or even make sense anymore, but you say them anyway, because this oven is alive, and it responds to respect, or fear, or both. Finally, when you can't wait anymore, you pull the loaves out. One is perfect, round, golden, crusted with honey. The other is a casualty, flat, half-cooked, burned on one side. You place them on the wooden cooling plank, the smell filling the longhouse like redemption. Even the dog lifts its head. The kids creep closer. You hand them each a piece of the broken loaf. They chew. It's not awful. Could have been worse. Could have been last week's salt brick disaster. You sit down, take a bite yourself, and try not to cry. Not because it's bad, because it's over. For now. The oven is cooling. The fire sleeps. The bread lives. You lived. Tomorrow it will begin again. Baking through the worst winters. The wind outside howls like a hungry wolf, and snow curls across the doorway in whispering flurries. But that doesn't stop you from dragging yourself out of your sleeping furs, just as the gray half-light of dawn begins to seep through the smoke hole. Your knees crack, your toes sting with cold, and your breath fogs in the air as you sit up, staring into the long, dark spine of another bitter Viking winter day. And of course, today is baking day. Because the snowdrifts might be tall enough to swallow a man, and the barn might be sealed shut with ice. But the oven still calls. It never sleeps, never waits, never cares that your fingers are numb and the fire pit is sulking after a night of neglect. You wrap your fur cloak tightly around your shoulders and pull your hood low, squinting toward the oven's corner. It sits there like an old memory that never really goes away, its blackened surface catching a glimmer of light from the crackling hearth, and for a moment you could almost imagine it was benign. But then you remember last winter, the great Yule collapse, the one where the oven cracked open in protest halfway through the second batch of loaves and smoked out half the household. The children had cried, the goats had panicked, and the entire longhouse had reeked of soot and shame for days. That was the year you almost considered building an outdoor fire pit and just going full Neanderthal with flatbreads on stone. Almost. But that would mean losing to the oven, and losing to the oven is not an option. So you rise, moving stiffly toward the clay behemoth, like a general approaching an unpredictable ally. The embers are dead. Of course they are. You crouch, crack your knuckles, and begin again. A flint, some dry moss, slivers of birch bark, your fingers fumble, stiff with cold, but finally the spark catches, and a tiny tongue of flame licks upward, trembling. You blow gently, coaxing it to life. The warmth grows, inch by inch, until you can finally feed it chunks of peat. The oven is awake, and it is hungry. Here's the mainstream fact, something historians have written plenty about. Viking winters were not just cold, they were lethal. With only a few hours of sunlight, bitter coastal winds, and frequent snowstorms, food preservation was a matter of life and death. Baking didn't pause for weather. In fact, bread was more crucial than ever in winter, when fresh vegetables were gone, meat was salted stiff as wood, and you needed dense, calorie-packed loaves just to get through a day. But the fringe truth, the one they don't teach in textbooks, is that baking in winter came with a different kind of terror. The oven was always a risk, but in winter it turned vicious. Cracked from cold, temperamental with damp fuel, and prone to sudden flare-ups, it became a test of will. A cold oven was worse than useless. It could devour your dough and still leave you hungry. Women would sometimes sleep beside the fire just to make sure the coals stayed warm enough to start baking in the morning. And if a storm hit mid-bake, you didn't stop. You didn't dare. Some older sagas even reference women fighting the frost demons with bread. A poetic exaggeration, perhaps, but not entirely untrue. You finish stirring the embers, watching the glow deepen, and turn to your flour stores. It's a sorry sight. The sack is half empty, the grind uneven from having to use frozen grain, and the water jug sloshes with a layer of ice on top. You chip it loose with a knife, pour it carefully into your mixing bowl, and begin the long process of transforming powder into sustenance. Your hands ache, but they know the motions. Press, fold, turn, stretch, over and over until the dough begins to resist you with that elastic stubbornness that means it might just rise this time. You kneel by the hearth, the fire now warm enough to help the dough swell, and you cover it with a cloth. You mutter something half prayer, half threat. "Don't you dare disappoint me." As the dough rests, you prepare the oven. The stones glow faintly now, and you test it with a flick of water. It hisses, but not violently. That's good. You scrape out the ash, brush the floor with a bundle of birch twigs, and breathe in the strange scent of heat, wood, and memory. It's almost meditative. If meditation involved third-degree burns and potential structural collapse. The scholarly debate here is fascinating. in a quiet, heated academia kind of way. Experts still argue about how Viking women managed baking during deep winter. Some claim it was done communally, with multiple families taking turns at a single hearth, rotating loaves like clockwork to maximize limited fuel. Others suggest women simply planned meticulously, baking once every few days and storing the loaves in straw-lined chests near the hearth to prevent freezing. But recent digs in Greenland suggest something stranger. Stone-lined baking pits outside the home, insulated with seaweed and turf. Was this a coastal adaptation? A ritual space? Or just someone's desperate solution to a broken indoor oven? No one agrees. What they do agree on is this: winter baking required cunning, stamina, and luck. You return to your dough. It has risen, slightly. Not gloriously, not beautifully, but enough. Enough to call it bread. You shape it into 2 rough rounds and cradle them like fragile eggs as you carry them to the oven. One false move and the chill could flatten them. You slide the loaves inside, quickly sealing the door with its warped plank and slapping mud around the edges. The moment of commitment. No going back now. You sit near the oven, wrapping your cloak tighter around yourself. The snow outside thickens, tapping softly on the roof like fingers from the sky. Time stretches. You hum quietly, a song your grandmother used to sing. Warm the grain, warm the soul, fire deep in clay-made coal. It doesn't rhyme in your language anymore, but the rhythm remains. After what feels like hours, you unseal the oven. Steam rushes out, clouding your face, and you cough as you reach in with your paddle. The first loaf is perfect, or as perfect as winter allows. Browned just enough, crust firm but not rock hard. The second? Split down one side, slightly raw in the middle, but edible. And in winter, edible is a miracle. You set them both on the cooling plank and lean back, exhausted. You've survived another baking. You've fed the fire, bent the dough to your will, and won. The oven might still be watching, but not with contempt. Maybe, just maybe, with grudging respect. You tear off a piece of the first loaf. It's warm, chewy, earthy, and it tastes like victory. When bread became currency and bribery. You're just about done with the last bite of the still steaming crust when your cousin barges in through the doorway, bringing with her a gust of frozen air, a sheepish look, and what appears to be an extremely apologetic chicken. She doesn't say anything at first. She just stands there, trying not to meet your eyes, until finally you raise one eyebrow, the universal Viking woman signal for what now? She holds up a small leather pouch and murmurs, "Mama said, could we borrow some of your bread?" You stare at her, then at the pouch, then at the chicken, which seems entirely uninterested in the political negotiations currently taking place. This isn't the first time, of course. It's not even the first time this week. Bread, in this house, in this era, in this life, isn't just food. It's leverage. It's reputation. It's power. You don't say yes right away. You've learned better. Instead, you slowly wipe your hands on your apron, walk over to the bread rack where the loaves are cooling, and run your fingers over their crusts with a soft click, click, click. The loaves respond like well-trained soldiers, holding their warmth, waiting for your command. Your cousin fidgets. She knows this is the ritual, the silent barter. The moment where you decide whether one loaf is worth the promise of help weaving tomorrow or gathering firewood or, God's forbid, cleaning out the privy trench. Bread, you've come to learn, is a form of currency. And today's exchange rate includes 2 eggs, a handful of dried cloudberries, and maybe, just maybe, a few hours of silent babysitting for your rowdiest sibling. You turn and tilt your head. "The chicken stays," you say. Your cousin nods so fast you're surprised her neck doesn't snap. Mainstream history likes to paint Viking trade as being all about silver, furs, and long-distance voyages to far-off lands. But what's often forgotten is the domestic economy, the quiet, everyday trades that held communities together. Bread was one of the most crucial elements of this soft-spoken commerce. In areas where coinage was rare and bartering ruled supreme, a good loaf could be exchanged for almost anything. A service, a tool, a bundle of herbs, even peace between feuding neighbors. And it wasn't just within households. Farmsteads often measured favor and reputation by the quality and reliability of their bread. A woman who could consistently produce unburnt, evenly risen loaves during the wet season. She had influence, she had quiet power. And in a world where you were often at the mercy of frost, fire, or fate, that kind of control mattered. The fringe fact here will either make you laugh or grimace, depending on your relationship with your own kitchen. In some remote settlements of 10th century Iceland, researchers discovered what appear to be bread tokens, small carved pieces of bone or antler exchanged ahead of time as placeholders for loaves still to be baked, almost like ancient bakery IOUs. A neighbor might hand over a carved token on a Monday, with the understanding that a fresh loaf would be delivered by Thursday's sunset. Failure to follow through could result in gossip, social snubs, or, in one documented case, a curse involving pickled herring and a goat skull. The exact purpose of these tokens is still under debate, but the implication is clear. Bread wasn't just food. It was promise, obligation, debt. You hand your cousin a medium-sized loaf, none of the honey-glazed ones, obviously, and take the chicken with as much dignity as you can muster. It stares at you balefully, clearly unenthusiastic about the terms of this agreement. Your cousin vanishes, feet crunching softly in the snow, and you're left holding a warm bird and a sense of grim satisfaction. This is what being a Viking woman really meant. Not swinging an axe or sailing to foreign shores. No, it was about holding your household together with crust and discipline. The scholarly debate continues around the symbolic role of bread in Norse ritual and society. While most agree that it had practical importance, others argue it held spiritual weight too. Some interpretations of the Eddas suggest bread was used in oath-making ceremonies, especially among women, where loaves were shared to seal promises or reinforce familial ties. Others think that's a poetic interpretation, that the sagas, rich in metaphor, use bread as a stand-in for hospitality and trust. But then, there are the darker interpretations. In some burial sites, charred remains of bread have been found placed beside the dead, especially women. Was this food for the afterlife? A final gesture of domestic pride? Or a warning to hell herself that this woman could bake, so she'd best be treated with respect? You set the chicken down on a stool and feed it a few spare barley grains. It seems content enough. You return to your fire, tending it gently, watching the flames dance. You have one more loaf to bake today. It's a rye round, heavy with last autumn's herbs, meant to be dried and eaten over the next week. You stir the remaining dough, your arms moving slowly now, muscle memory guiding the work. Outside, the wind picks up, rattling the walls of the longhouse with a sound like breath caught in a throat. The oven has cooled slightly, but you can feel it still radiating warmth. You slide in the final loaf, seal the door, and sit back. This one doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to survive. That's the secret, really. Not every loaf had to rise. Not every crust had to brown. But they had to feed. They had to last. And they had to mean something. A woman who could bake well didn't just feed her family. She could buy herself time, peace, even loyalty. The oven cracks once more. Not angrily, more like a groan from something tired but willing. You smile faintly. You know that sound. You've earned that sound. And when you pull the loaf out, some 20 minutes later, it's misshapen, a little uneven, but full of warmth and weight. It smells of time and grain and quiet triumph. You let it cool. Then, without thinking, you break off the heel, the first piece, and place it in a small wooden bowl on the floor, near the oven. Not for the gods, not for the spirits. Just in case. Bread fights and burnt offerings. The morning calm doesn't last long. Barely has your final loaf cooled before your sister storms in, breathless, red-faced, and clearly carrying some simmering mix of outrage and flour-dusted fury. You don't even get a greeting. Just a dramatic slap of her basket onto the table and a sentence fired off like a thrown axe. She said my crust was too thin. You blink slowly, your body still sore from kneading, baking, and negotiating with poultry. Who? You ask, although you already suspect. There's only one woman in the village bold enough to offer unsolicited opinions on other people's bread crusts. And she happens to be the widow who's been judging everyone's loaves since her husband died in a tragic mead barrel accident 20 winters ago. Your sister throws up her hands, as if hers isn't always dry enough to chip a tooth, and then she had the nerve to say I must have used ash water again. The scandal. Using ash water, made by soaking fireplace ash in water to create a mild lye, isn't uncommon, but it's frowned upon by purists. It gives the bread a sour, almost alkaline flavor. Not bad, just sharp, and using it is often seen as either a clever trick or a last resort, depending on who you ask. You sigh and pour your sister some warm milk. She drinks it like it's battle mead. So, you ask, what did you do? She shrugs, trying to look casual. I may have accidentally dropped my loaf into her water barrel. You choke slightly. Was it still hot? Very. The longhouse bursts into laughter, not just yours, but your mother's, the children's, even a muffled chuckle from your father's corner. Bread, as it turns out, causes more domestic chaos than livestock or inheritance disputes. There's a mainstream historical point hiding in this flour-dusted brawl. In Viking communities, women's identities were deeply tied to their baking. This wasn't just cooking, it was craftsmanship, proof of skill and attention and worth. A failed loaf wasn't just a personal setback. It could be interpreted as a sign of laziness, incompetence, or even bad luck. And in small communities where gossip spread faster than fire, reputation mattered. A good baker was respected. A bad one? Pitied. Or worse, pitied and mocked. But here's the fringe fact. In some regions of Scandinavia, public bread baking competitions were actually a thing. They weren't exactly formal events with judges and ribbons, but more like informal festivals, often around harvest or solstice, where women would present their best loaves for tasting. People voted with their mouths. Who brought the softest crumb, the richest crust, The most surprising ingredient? Honey-laced barley, apple-stuffed rye? And while there were no official prizes, the winner could expect favors, extra goods at market, offers for marriage alliances, maybe even first pick of the fish haul. Of course, not everyone took losing well. There are sagas, half fact, half fiction, that mention sabotage. Salt swapped for sugar. Peat swapped for fresh cow dung. Even one story about a woman baking her rival's comb into a loaf as a warning. Unconfirmed, but disturbing. Scholars are still trying to make sense of just how serious Viking baking was. Some argue that the competitiveness around it was exaggerated by later storytellers trying to romanticize the domestic life of Norse women. Others believe it was every bit as serious as battle prep, because in a world where winters were long and starvation was always a risk, the woman who controlled the food had real power, and power always breeds conflict. Back in your longhouse, the post-loaf drama continues. Your sister's adversary has apparently already sent a retaliatory message. A lump of raw dough left on your doorstep with a burnt crust tucked inside like an insult sandwich. It's both petty and oddly artistic. Your grandmother, meanwhile, declares that this is nothing new. In my day, she says, we didn't throw bread. We used it to curse people's goats. This leads to a half-hour digression into folk magic, as she explains how placing a crumbling loaf under someone's goat pen could bring misfortune, indigestion, or slightly sour milk. You're not sure how much of it to believe, but she speaks with the authority of someone who once baked in a clay pit during a thunderstorm and lived to brag about it. Later, you step outside with a loaf under your arm, one of your middling ones, not your best, not your worst, and walk across the icy yard to the widow's house. She opens the door before you even knock. If this is poisoned, she says, I want it with butter. You hand her the loaf. It's not poisoned, but it's dense enough to knock a squirrel unconscious if you throw it hard enough. She snorts. Better than your sister's. Her crust sounds like a birch plank. You both smile. You both know this isn't just about baking. It's about keeping the ritual alive. The rhythm of kneading and gossip, crust and pride. Before you go, she nods toward your coat. Next week, she says, I'll show you how to make chestnut flour. You raise an eyebrow. That's surprisingly generous. Chestnuts are rare this time of year. Deal, you reply, but only if you promise not to throw it at anyone. She doesn't promise. That night, as the household settles, you place one small, slightly overbaked loaf near the hearth. Not for food, but for peace. It sits there, warm and fragrant, and for the first time in days, the oven stays quiet. The rivalry has cooled, for now. But like any good bread, it may rise again, ovens, oracles, and other domestic superstitions. You wake before dawn to the low rumble of thunder somewhere beyond the hills, and instantly your thoughts go not to the fields, or the river, or even the roof that still leaks on the west side, but straight to the oven. Because thunder, in this part of the world, doesn't just mean rain. It means rising moisture, damp air, shifting heat. And the oven does not like shifting heat. You groan, stretch your shoulders, and run a hand over your brow, already damp from the warmth left clinging to the longhouse walls. As you shuffle toward the oven corner, still barefoot, still half asleep, you feel that familiar pressure in your chest, the sensation Viking women knew intimately. Not just stress, not just fatigue, something else. Anticipation, dread, something ancient. Because deep down, Even under layers of rationality and experience, part of you still believes the oven is watching, waiting, judging. You aren't alone in this feeling. Superstition wrapped itself around domestic life like steam curling from a stew pot, and nowhere was it more focused than the hearth. That oven, that soot-blackened, fire-fed beast in the corner, wasn't just a tool. It was sacred. It was dangerous. It was alive. You kneel and begin checking the coals, whispering a soft greeting under your breath, not because you think the oven will respond, but because it never hurts to be polite. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Hearth and oven rituals were commonplace throughout Norse and Germanic cultures. The hearth was the center of the home, not just physically, but spiritually. It was where warmth, food, and family gathered. Women lit the fire with intention, sometimes using embers saved from previous days to carry luck forward. Certain families even maintained unbroken hearth flames through the entire Yule season, believing that letting it die would invite misfortune. But now, here's the quirky fringe fact. Some women in early Viking settlements treated their ovens like oracles. Yes, oracles. If the fire caught too quickly, it meant good news was coming. If the coals smoked for too long, someone might fall ill. A bread that cracked down the center was said to predict division in the household. One that swelled upward too high? An unexpected visitor. You've even heard whispers that some women baked deliberately weird loaves, misshapen, salted oddly, with runes carved into their crusts, to test whether the oven would accept or reject them. If the loaf burst or refused to rise, that was seen as a sign, a warning, a no. Scholars today debate whether these customs were truly spiritual or simply the result of coincidence, repeated and retold until they took on meaning. Did women believe the oven had a will, or were they just creating order in a chaotic world by attaching meaning to unpredictable outcomes? Some archaeologists point to the consistent placement of hearths in homes across different regions as proof of ritual importance. Almost every longhouse had its fire set in a specific way, facing a specific direction. Others think that the mythology surrounding hearth spirits, such as the Scandinavian Gårdbo or Huskudar, may have evolved out of this intimate relationship between women and fire. After all, when your survival depends on something as fickle as a lump of clay and flame, it's easy to start imagining it has a personality. You finish stoking the fire, noting how the flames flutter and catch, steady but not overeager. A good sign. You smile and say quietly, "Thank you." The dough you prepared last night has risen beautifully, smooth, puffed, soft under your fingers. You shape it gently into 2 long loaves and sprinkle just a touch of flaxseed over the top. Flax is good luck, they say, keeps away quarrels. You slide the loaves into the oven with practiced grace, then seal it shut with the same mossy mud mixture that's held your kitchen together since forever. And then you wait. You always wait. There's a rhythm to it now. Kneel, seal, wait, whisper, listen. While you wait, your mind wanders to the stories, the old ones, the ones your grandmother used to tell when the snow was too thick to go outside and the fire was low, about the girl who angered her oven by baking too many sweets and not enough rye, and found her loaves replaced with pebbles. About the widow who swore she heard her dead husband coughing in the chimney every time she forgot to clean out the ash. About the bread that refused to brown until a lost ring was returned. You laughed at those stories when you were younger. Now, you find yourself watching the oven with more caution than mockery. It has moods. It remembers. It forgives slowly. The air in the longhouse thickens as the loaves bake. Warmth seeps into the walls, into your bones. The smell of toasting grain, of bubbling crust, wraps around you like a blanket. Then you hear it. Not a crack, not a bang, just a low thump, like something shifting inside the oven. You rush to unseal the door and peer in, heart pounding. One of the loaves has expanded sideways, pressing against the oven wall. Not burst, not burnt, just moved, as if it didn't want to be in its place. You frown. That's new. That's unsettling. You pull it out carefully and place it on the board. The second loaf is fine. Almost too fine. Evenly browned. Beautiful. Suspicious. You stare at it. Then, on impulse, you flip it over and carve a small symbol into the bottom with the tip of your knife. Just a circle. Just a question. You'll check it tomorrow, see if it's changed. You tell yourself this is silly. You tell yourself you're not becoming one of those women. But the truth is, in a world where storms can steal your roof, rats your grain, and ovens your eyebrows, you cling to what little magic you can. You slice into the quieter loaf and taste it. It's perfect. The other sits untouched, watching you with its crust uncracked, its flax unmoved. You swear you can almost hear it breathe, just once. The hidden politics of flour sacks. The quiet tension of yesterday's oven mystery still hangs in the air when you step outside the longhouse at first light. Your arms wrapped tightly around your chest, your breath forming clouds that melt into the faint haze of fog hugging the fields. Everything is soft this morning. The ground, thawing just slightly, has lost its sharp crunch. The chickens haven't yet begun their screeching protests, and the usual squabble over whose turn it is to fetch water hasn't yet erupted into shouted threats. But you feel something else brewing, an undercurrent of tension that has nothing to do with weather, or ovens, or even chickens. It's about the flour. And as any Viking woman with her ear to the frost-kissed ground knows, when the flour starts shifting hands too quietly, something is afoot. You step back into the longhouse just as your mother finishes pouring the last scoop of barley flour into your shared storage jar, licking her thumb to smooth the surface with a quiet sigh. "We're down to a half sack," she says without looking at you, "and the merchants haven't returned from the fjord." You nod. You've heard the rumors too, that the last shipment was delayed, that one of the boats tipped in a storm, that someone, probably a farmer's wife with more pigs than manners, offered extra salted fish in exchange for first pick of the grain. And so, quietly, invisibly, a silent war begins. Not with weapons, with flour. Here's the mainstream historical truth. The Viking world wasn't just about raids and warriors. A significant portion of daily life, particularly for women, revolved around the control and distribution of food staples, flour above all. Grain had to be ground, sifted, dried, and stored properly, and flour was measured, traded, and counted like gold. In times of shortage, it became political. Who had flour meant who had power. But here's the fringe historical detail that most people miss. In some settlements, flour was hidden, not from thieves, from neighbors. Anthropological digs at Viking-era homes in Iceland and Norway have uncovered double-layered storage pits, hidden compartments beneath firewood stacks or under animal hides, used to keep emergency flour away from prying eyes. In certain regions, women even stored flour inside sealed pots, disguised as soapstone cooking jars. The logic? If things got bad, You wanted flour that no one else knew about. And while technically most families shared resources in winter, technically doesn't fill your stomach when your cousin's breadbasket looks suspiciously plump. You walk over to your family's storage bench and lift the lid. Beneath the layers of carefully folded cloth lies the truth. You're short. Not panic short, but short enough that a particularly hungry week could mean flatbreads instead of loaves. You sigh and think quickly. You could go see Inga. She's always had a little extra, and her husband owes your uncle a favor. But that favor was from 2 summers ago and technically involved a sheep rescue gone sideways, so you're not sure how much it still counts. Or you could try Freitas. Her flour's always fine-milled and suspiciously white, which usually means she's been skimming the best of her grinding batches and saving it for herself. Which, if you're honest, is kind of genius. Of course, the third option is the swap. Dangerous, complicated, and full of potential shame. You trade something precious. Not tools, not clothes, not food. Reputation. You think back to last Yule, when Astrid traded a family secret to gain 3 scoops of flour. It was whispered that she revealed her brother's midnight visits to the thrall girl down by the river. In exchange, she got enough flour to make honey cakes. He got exiled. You brush that memory away and start planning. You'll begin with Freitas. She's arrogant, but she loves compliments like a pig loves mud. You bundle up the last of your soft woven wool, a leftover scrap from your aunt's weaving, and head down the frosty path toward her farm. The road winds through silent birch trees, and your breath sounds unnaturally loud. You reach her yard just as she's feeding her pigs, and you wave like you're just here to say hello. She sees the wool, smiles. "Out of flour, are we?" she asks, feigning innocence. You sigh. "Just a little short, and yours is always so finely ground." That does it. She practically purrs. You walk away 15 minutes later with a half bag of flour, your wool tucked in her greedy hands, and a promise to never mention how she got it. The scholarly debate that continues among historians revolves around whether women truly ran these quiet economies alone, or whether male oversight was more involved than the sagas suggest. Traditional interpretations often imagined Viking households as male-dominated, but newer. Scholarship paints a different picture. Women, especially older or widowed ones, held significant economic power, particularly when it came to food. The control of the flour, how it was ground, who received the best, what was saved, was a matter of skill, cunning, and social negotiation. And while men might have boasted about cattle and sales, women were managing the resources that actually kept people alive. Back in your longhouse, you mix the fresh flour with yesterday's water and leftover yeast from a particularly bubbly brew. The dough responds instantly, softening, expanding, taking a deep breath under your hands. You smile. The loaf rises faster than usual. You think of the white flour, of Freitas's smug grin, of the pig that stared at you the whole time like it knew something. But the loaf is real. The crust will brown, the meal will be warm, and when you place the baked bread on the wooden board later that evening, your family tears into it like it's victory itself. Because it is. Because in this world, a loaf well-earned is a triumph. You store the remaining flour deep inside the bench, beneath a folded fur, behind a basket of smoked fish. Not technically hidden, but not exactly obvious either. Just in case. Yeast, gossip, and the art of keeping things alive. The oven is quiet this morning, not brooding, not threatening, just calm, like it knows it doesn't need to prove anything today. You've fed it well, after all. The flour situation is under control, the bread rack is full, and nobody has dropped a loaf into anyone's water barrel lately. You should feel at ease. But you don't. Because now comes the most fragile, fickle, and frankly humiliating ingredient in the entire bread-baking universe: the yeast. And no, not the powdered, pre-measured, tamed little packets that modern kitchens take for granted. No one in your world has seen anything like that. Here, yeast is a living creature you've inherited. A bubbling jar of fermented mystery that has passed from grandmother to daughter to you like a wriggling, sour-smelling baby. And it needs constant attention. Too cold and it sulks. Too warm and it dies. Neglect it for more than a day and you risk awakening to a thin white film that smells faintly of despair. You walk over to the yeast pot now, holding your breath a little, lifting the cloth slowly, as if revealing a secret. And there it is, alive, bubbling gently, breathing like a soft, tired animal. You give it a stir, whisper a small thank you, and set it by the hearth to warm up. If the oven is the brute force engine of your bread making, the yeast is the soul. And the soul, as you've learned, is gossipy. Here's your mainstream historical anchor. Wild yeast fermentation was the backbone of traditional Viking baking. Unlike modern yeast, which can be bought and measured, Viking women had to cultivate and maintain their own starters. These were often mixtures of flour, water, and whatever wild yeast spores were floating in the air, or clinging to the sides of wooden bowls. The resulting sourdough starter could last for years, decades even, if kept alive properly. Women guarded theirs jealously. Recipes weren't written down, but everyone knew who had the good yeast. Some even believed that the yeast took on the personality of its keeper. If your starter was bubbly and fragrant, it meant you were a good homemaker. If it turned sour or sluggish, well, people talked. Which leads directly into today's delightful fringe detail. In certain villages, yeast became a tool of social control. Not officially, of course. There were no written yeast laws or fermentation courts, but unofficially, things got heated. If your neighbor refused to lend you yeast in a time of need, it wasn't just rude. It was a declaration of rivalry. She let her yeast die, people would whisper, eyes widening. And she didn't even ask for help. Imagine. Lending someone your starter, on the other hand, was a profound act of trust. You were giving them a piece of your kitchen's soul. If they let it spoil, that was grounds for a full social freeze-out. You think of all the little jars hidden in cupboards, cloaked in cloth, protected like relics. Of the whispered trades at the market, a ladle of mine for a scoop of yours, but don't tell Freitas. There were even stories of women stealing starters, sneaking into kitchens at night to swipe a spoonful of a particularly productive ferment. One saga mentions a woman named Solveig, who was accused of such a theft, and to prove her innocence, she had to bake a loaf in public with her own yeast to demonstrate that it rose the same as ever. The loaf collapsed. Solveig moved to Finland. Whether the story's true or not, you've never forgotten it. You test your own starter now by mixing a bit into some warm barley water and waiting. It foams almost immediately. You sigh with relief. Your soul is still intact. The scholarly debate around Viking fermentation practices is one of those niche rabbit holes that historians adore. Some argue that most yeast was gathered from brewing, since beer fermentation and bread making often shared tools and ingredients. Others believe that special yeast stones were used, heated rocks placed in the starter to encourage growth. There's even a faction that thinks sourdough starters were considered semi-sacred, passed down like heirlooms, their death mourned like a lost pet. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Women took it seriously. You mix your dough, the flour cool and soft beneath your fingers, the yeast fizzing slightly as it spreads. The scent is sharp, warm, comforting. You knead slowly, methodically, coaxing air into the dough like breath into lungs. The children giggle nearby, daring one another to poke it before you swat their hands away with a mock scold. "Do you want flatbread for a week?" you ask. They back off. They know that's not a threat. It's a warning. As the dough rests, you sit by the hearth with a mug of warm goat's milk and think about how this one invisible ingredient controls so much of your daily life. You've fought storms, bartered with cunning women, wrestled dough, soothed your oven like it was a wild animal. But none of it would matter without this little bubbling beast. And yet, for all its power, yeast is invisible. It doesn't roar like the oven or glow like the fire. It just is, working silently, transforming, creating. That evening, when you slice into the fresh loaf, crackling crust, chewy crumb, still warm in the center, you say a small, silent thank you to the pot. You won't forget to feed it tonight, because you're not just keeping yeast alive, you're keeping a legacy alive. One spoonful at a time. Bread theft and the case of the vanishing loaf. It starts with an empty shelf. Not an empty bread shelf, mind you. Those you expect, those you plan for, those you curse when someone forgets to bake. No, this is worse. It's the missing loaf shelf, the one you loaded carefully the night before, the one that should, at this very moment, be cradling a perfectly browned, honey-brushed round of barley-rye fusion, lovingly baked, cooled, and set aside for today's midday meal. You blink at the space as if squinting hard enough will bring the bread back. But it's gone. Not misplaced. Not accidentally eaten by your youngest sibling, though you wouldn't put it past him. Gone. And you know what this means. Not a mistake. Not an oversight. It means one thing. Someone stole your bread. Now, before you assume this is a small matter, just a loaf after all, just flour and time and heat, let's remind ourselves that in the Viking world, stealing bread was almost as insulting as stealing livestock. In some cases, more. A goat might wander off. A loaf? That's a message. Someone crossed the line. So you shift into investigative mode, tucking your hair back with one hand and scanning the longhouse like a detective with dough residue under your fingernails. You start by interrogating your sister. Not the youngest, the middle one, who once borrowed a cheese wheel and forgot to mention it until it rolled out of her blanket 3 days later. "Have you seen the bread?" you ask. She shrugs, suspicious. You question the boys next, your cousins, wild-haired and always half-starving. One of them's chewing, which looks very bad until you realize it's just pine bark. You move on. No luck. No one confesses, not even a hint of guilt. But there's something in the air, some whisper of nervous glances and shuffled feet. And then you spot the clue, a crumb trail. Not dramatic, just enough. A few toasted flakes near the back door, heading out into the yard. You follow. Around the corner of the longhouse, past the woodpile, and there, half hidden behind a rain barrel, is a half-eaten loaf. Your loaf, gnawed on by tiny teeth. You exhale. Rats, or maybe squirrels. Either way, the loaf is ruined, and you are furious. You weren't just baking for taste, you were baking for stability. And now, nature's tiny thieves have staged a full-on carb heist. Here's your mainstream fact. Rodents were a constant threat in Viking settlements. With long winters and tightly packed food stores, even a small infestation could cause massive damage. Women had to be endlessly vigilant. Food was stored in raised bins, sealed pottery, hanging baskets, and sometimes even tucked into the rafters to deter hungry invaders. But here's the fringe detail you probably didn't know. Some Viking women set literal bread traps, not for the rodents, but for people. In times of high tension, say during famine, a marriage dispute, or after a particularly messy feast, it wasn't uncommon for someone to bait a loaf and leave it out in plain view. If it disappeared and reappeared in someone else's household, instant scandal, public humiliation, sometimes even exile. Bread in this world wasn't just nourishment. It was evidence. It was bait. It was a social weapon. There's even a saga-like tale, half fable, half warning, of a woman who baked a loaf with a single chicken feather hidden inside, specifically to identify the thief by their coughing. Whether or not it's true, the message was clear. Mess with someone's bread, and you'd better be ready for war. You return to your longhouse and scan your own storage again, this time checking for gaps. And then you remember, yesterday, you left the cooling bread too close to the wall, right by the vent hole. A perfect entryway for vermin. A rookie mistake. You sigh, press your fingers to your temple, and immediately begin damage control. The rest of the bread must be moved. You instruct your siblings to check every corner for crumbs. Your mother nods approvingly. It's the first useful command you've given today. And just to be safe, you scatter a few herbal sachets around the kitchen. Mint, wormwood, a touch of thyme. They won't stop the rodents entirely, but they might confuse them long enough for you to come up with a better plan. The scholarly debate here is worth noting. Some historians argue that rodent prevention in Viking households was as sophisticated as anything found in Roman kitchens, especially in regions where food scarcity made every crumb precious. Others believe it was more reactive than proactive, dealing with infestation only once it had already become a problem. The truth probably lies in between. Households where women had the time, resources, and knowledge took precautions. Those that didn't, they made do. You, thankfully, are learning. That evening when you bake your replacement loaf, smaller, faster, rushed but edible, you place it high on a suspended board tied with leather cords. You balance it carefully, checking that it hangs evenly. And then, as a final insult to the rodent kingdom, you smear a thin line of bitter ash along the baseboard beneath the shelf. Not toxic, just disgusting. You smile to yourself, imagining a mouse's confused little face. You also leave out a decoy, a chunk of stale crust from yesterday, soaked in the strongest juniper tea you can make. It smells like sour pine and tastes worse. You place it in the same spot by the wall and dust a light circle of ash around it. In the morning, you'll check for footprints. It's not about revenge anymore. It's about principle. That night, when the bread is cooling above your head, safe and fragrant, and the family is dozing beside the hearth, you close your eyes and let yourself relax for the first time all day. One loaf lost, one lesson learned. One trap set. The bread wars aren't over, but you're ready. Bread theft and the case of the vanishing loaf. It starts with an empty shelf. Not an empty bread shelf, mind you. Those you expect, those you plan for, those you curse when someone forgets to bake. No, this is worse. It's the missing loaf shelf. The one you loaded carefully the night before. The one that should, at this very moment, be cradling a perfectly browned, honey-brushed round of barley-rye fusion. lovingly baked, cooled, and set aside for today's midday meal. You blink at the space as if squinting hard enough will bring the bread back. But it's gone. Not misplaced. Not accidentally eaten by your youngest sibling, though you wouldn't put it past him. Gone. And you know what this means. Not a mistake. Not an oversight. It means one thing. Someone stole your bread. Now, before you assume this is a small matter, just a loaf after all, just flour and time and heat, let's remind ourselves that in the Viking world, stealing bread was almost as insulting as stealing livestock. In some cases, more. A goat might wander off. A loaf? That's a message. Someone crossed the line. So you shift into investigative mode, tucking your hair back with one hand and scanning the longhouse like a detective with dough residue under your fingernails. You start by interrogating your sister. Not the youngest, the middle one, who once borrowed a cheese wheel and forgot to mention it until it rolled out of her blanket 3 days later. "Have you seen the bread?" you ask. She shrugs, suspicious. You question the boys next, your cousins, wild-haired and always half-starving. One of them's chewing, which looks very bad until you realize it's just pine bark. You move on. No luck. No one confesses, not even a hint of guilt. But there's something in the air, some whisper of nervous glances and shuffled feet. And then you spot the clue. A crumb trail. Not dramatic. Just enough. A few toasted flakes near the back door, heading out into the yard. You follow. Around the corner of the longhouse, past the woodpile, and there, half hidden behind a rain barrel, is a half-eaten loaf. Your loaf, gnawed on by tiny teeth. You exhale. Rats. Or maybe squirrels. Either way, the loaf is ruined, and you are furious. You weren't just baking for taste, you were baking for stability. And now nature's tiny thieves have staged a full-on carb heist. Here's your mainstream fact. Rodents were a constant threat in Viking settlements. With long winters and tightly packed food stores, even a small infestation could cause massive damage. Women had to be endlessly vigilant. Food was stored in raised bins, sealed pottery, hanging baskets, and sometimes even tucked into the rafters to deter hungry invaders. But here's the fringe detail you probably didn't know. Some Viking women set literal bread traps, not for the rodents, but for people. In times of high tension, say during famine, a marriage dispute, or after a particularly messy feast, it wasn't uncommon for someone to bait a loaf and leave it out in plain view. If it disappeared and reappeared in someone else's household, instant scandal, public humiliation, sometimes even exile. Bread, in this world, wasn't just nourishment. It was evidence. It was bait. It was a social weapon. There's even a saga-like tale, half fable, half warning, of a woman who baked a loaf with a single chicken feather hidden inside, specifically to identify the thief by their coughing. Whether or not it's true, the message was clear. Mess with someone's bread, and you'd better be ready for war. You return to your longhouse and scan your own storage again, this time checking for gaps. And then you remember, yesterday, you left the cooling bread too close to the wall, right by the vent hole. A perfect entryway for vermin, a rookie mistake. You sigh, press your fingers to your temple, and immediately begin damage control. The rest of the bread must be moved. You instruct your siblings to check every corner for crumbs. Your mother nods approvingly. It's the first useful command you've given today. And just to be safe, you scatter a few herbal sachets around the kitchen. Mint, wormwood, a touch of thyme. They won't stop the rodents entirely, but they might confuse them long enough for you to come up with a better plan. The scholarly debate here is worth noting. Some historians argue that rodent prevention in Viking households was as sophisticated as anything found in Roman kitchens, especially in regions where food scarcity made every crumb precious. Others believe it was more reactive than proactive, dealing with infestation only once it had already become a problem. The truth probably lies in between. Households where women had the time, resources, and knowledge took precautions. Those that didn't, they made do. You, thankfully, are learning. That evening, when you bake your replacement loaf, smaller, faster, rushed but edible, you place it high on a suspended board tied with leather cords. You balance it carefully, checking that it hangs evenly. And then, as a final insult to the rodent kingdom, you smear a thin line of bitter ash along the baseboard beneath the shelf. Not toxic, just disgusting. You smile to yourself, imagining a mouse's confused little face. You also leave out a decoy, a chunk of stale crust from yesterday, soaked in the strongest juniper tea you can make. It smells like sour pine and tastes worse. You place it in the same spot by the wall and dust a light circle of ash around it. In the morning, you'll check for footprints. It's not about revenge anymore. It's about principle. That night, when the bread is cooling above your head, safe and fragrant, and the family is dozing beside the hearth, you close your eyes and let yourself relax for the first time all day. One loaf lost, one lesson learned, one trap set. The bread wars aren't over, but you're ready. Bread for the dead, loaves, loss, and strange goodbye rituals. The morning doesn't start with the smell of baking or the sound of squabbling over who gets the first crust. It starts with silence. Heavy silence. The kind that falls over a household when grief walks in, takes off its boots, and sits down like it intends to stay a while. Someone has died. Not close family, more like a cousin once removed, the sort who came by often enough to be part of the rhythm, but not so often that you ever really knew them. Still, death is death, and in your world, death means bread. Not in the way you might expect. Not, let's all eat bread and celebrate life, like some modern funeral buffets, but bread as ritual, bread as offering, bread as memory. You're already reaching for the flour before anyone tells you to. It's just what you do. Bread for the dead. And suddenly, you're navigating one of the strangest, oldest, and most quietly sacred parts of Viking life. Here's the mainstream fact. Food offerings were central to Norse funeral customs, and bread played a subtle but important role. While the sagas talk more about mead, meats, and feasting, archaeological digs show that bread, especially flatbreads and griddle cakes, were buried with the dead or placed near grave mounds. It wasn't just sustenance for the journey to the afterlife. It was a message, a comfort, a final piece of home. But here's the strange, fringe detail that most don't know. In some regions, women baked what they called spirit loaves, small, unsalted, unseasoned breads shaped into quiet little symbols. A wheel for safe passage, a circle for eternity, a spiral for rebirth. These loaves weren't meant to be eaten. They were meant to be held, buried, or broken and scattered along the wind. And even stranger, some women whispered messages into the dough as they needed. Apologies, confessions, secrets. Things they wished they'd said while the person was still alive. Because if bread can rise, maybe voices can too. You knead your dough now. Not for taste, not for fluff, but for weight. This loaf must be heavy, firm, solid. You use the darkest rye you can find, mix in barley for texture, and add just a breath of honey. Not enough to sweeten, just enough to remember. And while you work, you think about the stories. Not the epic ones, the small ones. How he once tried to smoke fish with moss and nearly burned down the shed. How he carved a bird into the doorframe when no one was looking. How he always brought extra wood during winter, even when his own fire was low. You press those thoughts into the dough with each turn, letting memory stretch into gluten. Your youngest sibling watches you silently. You think about offering them a piece of dough to shape. Then you remember they're still too young to understand why this matters. You'll teach them someday. You place the loaf into the oven without marking it. No symbols this time. Just silence. Just heat. Just waiting. The scholarly debate surrounding bread in Viking funerals is surprisingly fierce. Some argue that it wasn't bread at all, but funeral cakes. Griddle-made, pan-seared, closer to pancakes than loaves. Others believe that bread was burned in the funeral pyre itself, not buried. Still others suggest that the bread was for the living, not the dead, a gesture of hospitality to those who came to mourn. But oral traditions persist. Stories pass through families about ghost bread, about loaves that didn't mold, about slices that vanished from locked pantries. There's even a tale from a fjordside village where a woman claims she dreamed of her dead sister for 7 nights straight, until she finally baked a bread and buried it beside the river. The dream stopped. She never baked that recipe again. You remove your loaf from the oven. It's dark, dense, slightly cracked. Perfect. You wrap it in a simple cloth, nothing fancy, and carry it to the clearing where the fire has already been built. No one says much. A few murmurs, a few sniffles. Someone coughs. You place the bread beside the kindling, and your aunt lights the flame. The loaf sits there, close but not consumed. It's part of the ceremony. A witness. As the fire rises, the bread warms but never burns. Smoke curls around it, lifting little pieces of crust toward the sky. And for just a moment, you feel like it's enough. Like he'll know. Afterward, when the ashes settle and people begin drifting away in pairs and trios, someone hands you back the bread. Unburned. Untouched. You're expected to bury it at home. You do, later that evening. Beneath the juniper bush beside the animal pens, where the earth is soft and the roots cradle things gently. You cover it carefully, say nothing, and walk away. That night, the oven stays cold. You don't bake. No one does. It feels right. Bread is about life. Today wasn't, but tomorrow will be. Bartering with bread, loaves, lies, and the secret marketplace. It's trade day, and the air smells like wet wool, horse sweat, and ambition. You're barely awake, rubbing crust from your eyes, and already counting how many loaves you've wrapped in linen for the journey to the village center. Not because you plan to sell them. Money is for nobles and coin hoarders. But because today, your bread is currency. And currency, as you know by now, is all about timing, posture, and confidence. You stack the loaves, 6 in total. 3 heavy barley rounds, 2 honey-flavored oat cakes, and 1 strange experiment involving dried elderberries that you're honestly hoping someone takes just out of curiosity. Your apron smells like smoke and cinnamon. Your hands are dusted with flour that won't come off no matter how many times you scrub. And your sister is already arguing over whether to bring the goat milk in a wooden jug or a clay pot. You settle it with a single glance. Clay. Wooden jugs leak. She pouts. You ignore it. The road to the village is muddy, churned up by cartwheels and boot soles, but there's an energy in the air that makes you walk faster. Trade day isn't just a marketplace. It's a social map. Who's got fish to spare? Who needs wool? Who's fighting with whom? And, most importantly, whose bread gets noticed. You've been working on your loaves for weeks, perfecting the color, the weight, the way the crust sounds when tapped. Because this isn't just baking, this is branding. And Viking women, whether they knew it or not, were excellent at branding. Mainstream historical fact? Viking women were deeply involved in domestic economies. While men went raiding or sailed off to trade in faraway markets, women controlled the local flow of goods. They ran farms, organized food production, and oversaw distribution. Bread was often bartered for items of necessity: fish, dairy, wool, even iron tools, and women held the power to determine its worth. But here's where it gets delightfully odd. Some women infuse their bread with subtle tells. Not poison, not magic, just little hints. The use of particularly rare herbs or expensive honey, a signature pattern carved into the crust, a shape slightly different from the norm. These small tweaks acted like calling cards. Everyone knew who baked what. And if someone copied your signature style, oh, it was war. You reach the edge of the trading circle and immediately take note. Fridas is here, of course, with her ridiculous pine nut twists that always sell out first. Her bread is too soft, you think, probably underbaked. She smiles at you with that look that says, "Good luck, dear, you'll need it." You ignore her and set up your station. Linen cloth laid flat, loaves arranged in descending size order, the elderberry one in the center like a curiosity. You've also brought a few ash-baked flatbreads in a side basket, just in case someone wants quantity over quality. The first trade comes quickly. A fisherman's daughter who offers dried herring for a small barley loaf. You sniff the fish, nod politely, and make the swap. The next is better. A hunter's wife with fox pelts. You hesitate, then point to the oat cake. She adds a pouch of juniper berries. Deal. But then comes the real moment. The barter that every woman waits for. The test. A stranger, likely from another village. Her boots are clean. Her eyes are sharp. And she's walking directly toward your table. She pauses, inspects, picks up the elderberry loaf. "Unusual," she says. You smile. "One of a kind?" She considers. "I'll trade you a jar of pickled plums and a comb made from whalebone." You blink. That's high value. Too high. Something's off. You scan her face. Is she bluffing, trying to get you to agree before someone else sees the comb? Or does she know what you've got? You glance at the elderberry loaf again. It's nothing special, but it's different. Different draws attention. You lean forward. "2 jars, you say." She snorts. Bold. You smile wider. "And half a beehive's worth of beeswax, and it's yours." She blinks, laughs, and walks away. But you saw it in her eyes. Respect. That's better than the trade. A nearby elder woman chuckles. "You could have gotten 1 jar and the comb," she says. "I know," you reply. "But now she'll tell everyone she couldn't afford my bread." You turn back to your table and rearrange the loaves. Your sister is glowing with pride. "You're going to run out," she says. You nod. That's the idea. And sure enough, by early afternoon, you've swapped every loaf for goods that clink, clatter or carry weight. You return home with bags heavier than you left with. And word has already spread. People ask about the elderberry loaf now. What was in it? What did it mean? Where did you find the berries? The scholarly debate surrounding Viking women and barter economies centers on whether their influence was formal or informal. Some claim that women were merely extensions of household needs. Others argue that women effectively operated as economic agents, leveraging their baking, weaving, and fermenting skills into local dominance. Based on today, you side with the latter. You didn't just bake, you negotiated, you influenced, you shaped the market with a crust and a smile. Back home, you unwrap your goods, the pickled fish, the pelts, the beeswax, the jar of early spring berries you managed to pry from a beekeeper's nervous wife. And one small thing you hadn't expected, a carved charm made of wood tucked into your flatbread basket. A thank you from someone, maybe. Or a token, a whisper. You hold it for a moment, wondering what it means. Then you set it on your shelf and start mixing flour for tomorrow. The elderberries are gone, but the story remains. Crumbs, codes, and the underground loaf network. The storm last night left everything soaked. The thatch drips steadily. The ground is a muddy tapestry of boot prints, and your hands are already numb from wringing out the cloth you hung by the hearth. But none of that matters, because today isn't about chores or trade or even survival. Today is about secrets. You press your fingers into a lump of fresh dough and glance at the door. No one's around. Good. You reach beneath the wood bin and pull out a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. A loaf you baked yesterday, when the others weren't looking. A plain barley round on the outside. But inside, rolled within the crumb is a tightly folded strip of lambskin parchment, inked, sealed with beeswax, and pressed flat between folds of flour and air. A message, a whisper, a risk. Because in this village, especially now, people are watching. And bread, as innocent as it seems, is no longer just food. It's a carrier, a courier, a silent voice. You weren't the first to use it this way. Your mother tells stories of women who used marked loaves to signal feuds, friendships, or forbidden love. But this goes deeper. The message hidden in this loaf isn't about gossip or apologies. It's about protection. Someone in the next village is being watched. Her brother's gone missing. Her husband's been accused of theft. She needs a name cleared, or a warning delivered, or something that only the right person can do. But letters get intercepted. Runners get questioned. Bread? Bread goes unnoticed. Here's your mainstream fact. During times of political tension or clan disputes, Norse women often acted as go-betweens, carrying messages, negotiating ceasefires, even arranging secret trades or exchanges. They were overlooked by warriors, underestimated by rivals, and trusted within households. Bread, being ever-present and non-threatening, became a tool in these quiet negotiations. But now for the truly quirky historical twist. In a few isolated Viking settlements, particularly along trade routes through Norway and northern Scotland, there's archaeological evidence suggesting the use of code breads. These weren't cryptic symbols carved on crusts, though that happened too. These were loaves shaped in subtly unusual ways, used to identify who made them or where they were going. One excavation uncovered dozens of bread molds with slight shape variations, none of them practical for baking differences, but highly consistent between regions. Some historians argue they were simply decorative. Others believe they were signatures, like edible passwords. If someone handed you a five-pointed barley star in a region that only made round loaves, you knew the baker, and more importantly, the message. Back in your longhouse, you wrap your special loaf in an extra cloth, tuck it into the bottom of a basket of ordinary bread, and hand it to your cousin. "Take this to Aunt Sigrid's," you say casually. "Tell her the honey's in the back." He nods, shrugs, and skips off into the drizzle, unaware that he's carrying more than a snack. You return to the fire, heart beating a little faster, palms still damp from handling secrets. It's not the first message you've baked, and it won't be the last. The scholarly debate around clandestine communication among Viking women is murky, largely because it wasn't documented formally. Men wrote the sagas. They recorded battles and voyages, not whispered arrangements made in the kitchens. But oral histories, regional folk tales, and the occasional artifact hint at something deeper. Stories of women who moved armies with meals, who sent warnings with flour, who swapped locations, dates, or escape plans through crumbs and crusts. It might not be universally accepted history, but then, neither is your loaf, and it still carries weight. That evening, you get confirmation. A knock at the door. A child, maybe 7 or 8, holding a small bundle wrapped in brown cloth. "For you," they say, and vanish into the fog. Inside the cloth, a roll of beeswax-soaked wool and a carved wooden comb, a symbol of thanks, a mark of trust. No words, none needed. The message was received. You smile, press the items to your chest, and return to the kitchen. No one asks why you're humming. No one notices the extra loaf you set aside for tomorrow. But you know. And somewhere, someone else does too. Tomorrow's loaf will carry another note. Maybe not one written in ink. Maybe one in shape, or in spice, or in timing. And maybe someday, someone will dig it up, centuries from now, and wonder why this bread was different, why it mattered. You hope they understand. Smoke signals and the oven that listens. The oven has moods. You've said it before, and now, as you stand there watching the smoke curl from its mouth like a smug dragon, you know it's having one of those days. The dough is perfect, elastic, warm, proofed under a wool blanket like a swaddled child. But the oven? The oven is sulking. You fed it pine wood, just like always. You gave it time to heat up. You even whispered something soft to it, your little charm that usually does the trick. And yet, the heat is wrong. It's either too low or too high, and the smoke is telling you something, you just haven't figured out what. You kneel by the mouth of the oven and stare at it. "What's your problem?" you ask aloud. The fire pops in response, and the smoke swirls toward your face. You cough, wipe your eyes, and sigh. This will be one of those baking days, and it will test every bit of knowledge you've gathered from years of watching women coax bread from chaos. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Viking ovens, like most in early medieval Europe, weren't temperature controlled. There were no dials, no gauges, just fire, patience, and instinct. Women learned to read their ovens by how the smoke moved, how the soot clung to the walls, how a handful of flour would brown or burn when tossed on the hearthstone. Ovens were semi-sacred zones, central to the home and the family's survival. And yet, they were never tamed. You didn't control the oven, you negotiated with it. And that's what you're doing now. Negotiating. You stoke the embers gently, shift the wood a bit to the left, and add a bundle of dried juniper twigs, not just for the heat but for the smell. You've learned the tricks. Different woods affect different doughs. Birch adds a sweetness. Alder burns clean. Driftwood, if you're lucky enough to get it, makes the crust shatter like glass. But then there's the smoke. That unpredictable, swirling storyteller that every baker learns to fear and respect. And here's the fringe fact. Some Viking women used the oven's smoke as a kind of signal, almost like weather forecasting. If the smoke clung to the ground, rain was on the way. If it rose quickly and disappeared, clear skies. But more than that, women believed the smoke could listen, not magically, not superstitiously, but sympathetically, as if the oven itself responded to mood, to intent, to energy. If you were distracted, the oven misbehaved. If you were calm and focused, the smoke rose clean. It sounds like nonsense until you've lived it. You've had days where everything goes wrong. Bread burns, dough collapses, and the smoke chokes you out like a scorned spirit. And you've had days where every loaf sings. Today, it's somewhere in between. You test the hearth with a stick, holding it in place and watching the tip char. The color tells you everything. Too pale and the oven's still cold. Too black and it's already too late. You toss in a small, sacrificial loaf, flat, fast, and designed to die for the cause. It comes out, mostly okay. Good enough to risk the real loaves. You whisper one last thing to the oven, something you barely believe yourself anymore, and slide in the dough. Then you sit and wait and watch the smoke. The scholarly debate around smoke use in Viking domestic life is fascinating. Some believe it was purely functional, just a side effect of wood-burning ovens. Others argue that smoke had symbolic meaning. It carried messages. It warded off spirits. It connected the home to the gods. There are even tales of women watching the smoke trails to determine whether a raid was coming or whether a marriage would succeed. That might be myth, or it might be a metaphor. But it speaks to something real. The idea that domestic life, cooking, baking, burning, was its own kind of wisdom. Your grandmother once said that if you couldn't read smoke, you couldn't raise a family. At the time, you thought she was being dramatic. Now, you aren't so sure. The bread begins to rise. You smell it before you see it. Warm grain, toasted crust, the faintest edge of caramelized honey. You don't open the oven yet. That's the final test. You wait until the smoke thins, until it rises like a straight line into the cold sky, and only then do you reach for the paddle. You pull out the first loaf, then the second. Both are browned, cracked, alive. You smile. The oven has forgiven you. For now. But just as you place them on the cooling rack, the wind shifts. The smoke changes. You pause. Look. Sniff. There's a scent you don't recognize. Not wood, not flour, not fire. Something metallic? A warning? You rush to the door, step outside, and look toward the hills. Nothing. Just mist and trees. But your stomach tightens. The oven has said what it wanted to say, and you know better than to ignore it. Baking in exile. Ash bread, river stones, and starting again. The sky is pale gray, stretched thin like overwashed wool, and you're standing beside a cold stream in a place that doesn't yet feel like home. The trees are unfamiliar. The birds don't sing the same. Even the soil smells wrong, damp and sharp, like the earth is still suspicious of you. You've been here for 3 days, long enough to build a rough shelter, long enough to gather firewood, but not long enough to find comfort. Still, today you're going to bake, because if you don't, something inside you might crack like under-kneaded crust. You don't have an oven anymore. It burned with the rest of the longhouse. All you have is a flat river stone and a borrowed fire pit that still smells faintly of trout and wet moss. But you have flour, barely, and your hands. That's enough. You kneel beside the stone and begin. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Viking women were masters of improvisation when it came to baking. During migrations, raids, exiles, and long overland journeys, they learned to bake without ovens, using heated stones, ash pits, and even embers. Flatbreads were the go-to. Simple, fast, and forgiving. Some were made so thin they resembled parchment. Others were thick as your palm and meant to last for days. Bread in exile wasn't about delicacy. It was about memory, about survival. You mix water into the flour with your fingers, kneading slowly, methodically. There's no salt, no yeast, no herbs, just grain and instinct. The dough is tough and dry, but that's the point. It has to hold together when you toss it into the ashes. You shape it into small rounds, 6 of them, one for each member of your scattered little group. You don't talk much these days. There's too much unspoken. Loss clings like smoke. And yet, when the others see you baking, they sit nearby, quietly, watching, as if the act of kneading and shaping is its own kind of prayer. You brush the ashes aside and lay the first round directly on the hot stone. It hisses. You cover it lightly with embers and wait. It's a dangerous method, easy to burn, easy to overcook, but it works, because it has to. Here's the quirky fact. Some Viking women in exile were known to bake bread using heated shields. Not often. Shields were too valuable to risk. But in desperate times, a round metal boss made a decent surface for a flatbread. There's even a fragmentary saga that mentions a woman who baked ash cakes on a raider's shield, with the storm at her back and death in her throat. No one knows if it's true, but the image endures. You flip the bread. The crust is blackened at the edges, but the center puffs slightly, steam trapped inside, warmth blooming. It smells bitter and comforting all at once. You hand it to your sister without a word. She breaks it in half and gives you a piece. It's chewy, gritty, a little sour, but it tastes like home, or at least the memory of it. The scholarly debate around ash bread is less about technique and more about symbolism. Some historians argue that these rough loaves were the food of shame, exile, poverty, defeat. Others believe they held a sacred place in Norse life, a food of endurance, of rebirth. When everything else is gone, your house, your roof, your orchard, bread remains. Simple, scorched, stubborn, just like you. You bake the rest of the rounds slowly. No one speaks until the last one is done. Then the old man who used to sharpen blades in your village, his hands now trembling from cold, tells a story about a woman he knew in his youth who baked in secret after her entire clan was banished. She used river water, birch ash, and crushed pine nuts, claimed it helped her remember her dead husband's voice. You nod. You believe it. Food keeps memories in the cracks between bites. That night, you store your leftover bread in a leather pouch and hang it from a tree branch, high enough to avoid animals, low enough to reach in the morning. You lie on the dirt floor of the shelter and stare up at the makeshift roof. Rain seeps through in places. A beetle crawls along a beam. But you're full, not just in the stomach, in the spirit. You baked, you fed, you continued. The others are asleep beside you. One of them snores. Someone murmurs in a dream, and the ashes outside still glow faintly. like memory, like warmth, like hope. Tomorrow, you'll find better wood, maybe some wild herbs, maybe salt if you're lucky. But for tonight, ash bread will do. The feastless festival, when bread had to pretend. The moon is full, fat and golden as it hangs low over the clearing, and if this were any other year, the village would be buzzing. You'd hear laughter echoing off the longhouse walls, see torchlight dancing on every face, and smell roasted meat curling through the air like a promise. But this year is quiet. Too many have left. Too many have lost. The festival is still happening because tradition insists, but it's stripped down to its bare bones. No mead, no honey-glazed venison, just bread. Lots and lots of bread. And not the good kind either. Not the festival loaves filled with cardamom or the braided wreaths shaped like sunwheels. No, tonight's bread is functional. Tough. Dry. Made with whatever scraps of flour, barley, and crushed acorns people could pull together. You stand in the middle of the village square holding a tray of these crumbly, somber loaves and try to smile. They're warm, at least. And they smell, well, they smell like effort, like trying, like dignity wrapped in a crust. Here's your mainstream fact. Viking festivals were deeply rooted in food. Seasonal feasts like Yule and Midsummer weren't just parties. They were sacred times, meant to honor the gods, the dead, and the turning of nature's wheel. Bread played a huge role in these gatherings, especially ceremonial bread shaped into symbols of fertility, strength, or protection. Some were round to represent the sun. Others had embedded seeds to symbolize growth. But then there were the lean years, the years when crops failed or trade routes were cut off or raids had stripped the storehouses bare. And here's your quirky twist. In those years, Vikings still celebrated, but they did it with what scholars call mock foods. That meant creating the shape or appearance of abundance using humble ingredients. A flatbread painted with berry juice to mimic meat glaze, a hollow loaf shaped like a roast bird, even breads filled with dried leaves and bark, so they looked heavy and generous, even if they weren't. It was about morale, about illusion, about telling the community, we're still here, we're still us. And tonight, that's what you're doing. You hand out your loaves to a row of tired elders wrapped in patched cloaks and say things like, still warm from the oven, and this one's got some thyme in it, even if the thyme is really just crushed juniper leaves. The important thing is the ritual, the act, the shared fiction that binds a people together. The oven was hard to light today. Damp wood, uncooperative wind, but you coaxed it into heat eventually, whispering to it like an old friend. You used the last of your lard and stretched it with water, then added a handful of expired oats that smelled more like straw than grain. Still, you shaped each loaf by hand, pressed lines into the tops, brushed them with milk from a very grumpy goat. And as you baked, you remembered how your mother used to sing during festival prep, loudly, off-key, confidently. You hum a few bars now just for memory's sake. A child comes by, eyes wide, and grabs a loaf with both hands like it's treasure. You ruffle their hair and tell them it's filled with sun dust. They don't ask what that means. They just giggle and run off. That's the thing about bread. It lets you lie kindly. Scholarly debates about mock feasts center on whether they were acts of desperation or resilience. Some historians see them as failures, signs that a village had declined beyond function. But others argue the opposite. that these faux celebrations were acts of cultural defiance. If you could still sing, still gather, still bake, even with crumbs, you hadn't lost. You were still Viking. You were still human. As night deepens, the loaves dwindle. You see neighbors you haven't spoken to in weeks. They nod, take bread, sit in small clusters. No one dances this year, but someone tells a story. Then another, and soon there's a rhythm, not of music, but of memory. One woman describes her uncle's bread oven exploding in a storm. A man recalls a loaf so hard it chipped his tooth before battle. Laughter trickles in, real, warm laughter. You eat your own loaf slowly, chewing each bite like it matters. It does. At the edge of the crowd, someone has carved a new bread charm. Just a circle, no runes. It's simple, honest, like this night. As the fire pit crackles and the stories build, you realize something. This feast, quiet and crumb-filled as it is, might mean more than the grand ones, because this one had to be fought for. Not with swords, but with dough and will and the belief that bread can carry joy even when joy is scarce. You go to bed with a full heart, not a full stomach, but close enough. The hearth rebuilt, bricks, bones, and baking backwards. The spring thaw comes slowly, like a hesitant guest knocking at the door. One morning the frost doesn't return. Another day, you notice the stream isn't whispering beneath ice anymore, but giggling with pebbles. The snow finally retreats into the shadows of trees and hollows, and life, color, movement, the creak of growing things, tentatively returns. And so too does your decision. It's time to rebuild the oven. Not just for warmth, not just for baking, for identity, for control, for something that smells like home and rises when you ask it to. You walk to the clearing just past the old birch grove, where the ground is firm and dry, and kneel with your fingers pressed into the soil. The earth is soft and receptive. You dig your hands into it like you're asking permission. There's something sacred about starting an oven from scratch, and you feel the weight of every woman before you who did this exact thing in years of peace and years of war. You gather stones from the riverbank, wide and flat for the base, rounded for insulation. You trade with a neighbor for clay, rich red stuff that smells like the bottom of a lake, and begin to build, brick by stubborn brick. Here's your mainstream fact. Viking ovens weren't all built the same. Wealthier homes had dome-shaped clay ovens insulated with turf, while poorer families often cooked over flat hearthstones or used communal ovens. The dome oven was especially prized, allowing consistent heat and more complex baking. Rebuilding one took days. It was often done with help, by women, children, the old. It wasn't just construction, it was community. But here's your oddball fringe discovery. In some Norse settlements, bones, animal, and even human, were added to the oven's clay walls, not for strength, not for superstition, but for memory. One Icelandic tale tells of a widow who mixed her husband's ashes into the brick of her hearth so she could bake with his warmth every morning. Another speaks of warriors' bones lining the ovens of feasting halls to remind the living of what sustained them. Whether literal or metaphorical, no one agrees. But you think of it now as you bury the first of your own oven bricks into place. You press a tiny carving from your old home, a bread stamp shaped like a hawk, into the foundation, right where the flame will kiss it each day. Not for show, for you. Your sister helps with the frame, though she complains about the smoke before it even exists. A neighbor boy mixes clay while humming tunelessly. An old woman you've barely spoken to since arriving appears with a bucket of sand and says only, "I knew your mother. She'd want it round, not square." You don't ask how she knew. You just nod and build it round. The scholarly debate around hearth reconstruction focuses not just on engineering, but on symbolism. A hearth was the center of the Norse home, physically and emotionally. It represented safety, tradition, even legal standing. Some laws couldn't be spoken unless heard by the hearth. Rebuilding one wasn't just practical. It was political, cultural, spiritual. By sunset on the third day, your oven stands, lopsided, uneven, beautiful. You light the first fire slowly, letting the clay cure with smoke and warmth. It smells like progress, like effort, like dignity. And when the flames catch and the first real smoke curls upward, your eyes sting, not from the soot, but from something older. You've been waiting for this, not just to bake, to begin. You mix dough even though your arms ache. You hum the old bread song even though your throat is dry. You shape loaves, not for barter, not for festival, not for hidden messages, but for dinner. Plain barley, a hint of salt. You bake them in your oven and watch the crust crackle like waking skin. When you hand one to the neighbor boy, he bites in and grins. "It's good," he says, mouth full. "Warm," your sister adds. "Tastes like before." You sit by the oven long after everyone's left, listening to the coals murmur their strange old language. You don't need them to speak clearly. You understand. They're saying, "You're back. Not where you were, but you are back, and that's enough."